Leslie Andren, an avid viewer of Sachs Realty podcast, reached out a couple of weeks ago wanting to come on our channel and talk about her experience in the multifamily or apartment industry, as well as her experience in banking and funding loans, commercial loans, working with acquisitions, people buying REITs, buying multifamily housing, apartment complexes, but really what her opinion is of where we're going with the U.S. economy and our housing market as a whole, because she believes this next downturn could be worse than the global financial crisis that we experienced back in 2008. Let me just give you a little taste of her resume so that you understand why I was so excited to have her on our show. As far as her education, she received her MBA from University of Wisconsin-Madison with a double major in real estate and finance. And her undergrad was at Kenyon College, where she majored in history and minored in American history. Leslie also went on to get her real estate broker license, and she's worked in the commercial real estate space for decades on both the banking, the investor or operator side of things. And now she just wants to share her knowledge about what her opinion from decades of experience, what her opinion is on the state of the housing market, the economy overall, and she believes that we are going to enter a time that will be worse than the great financial crisis. I hope you enjoy the show. Leslie, thank you so much for joining our channel. You know, I'm excited you reached out. You've watched our channel for quite some time, and you've said you're a fan, which is an honor to me, because I think what our audience is going to see here is that you have a lot of experience in the real estate industry. I'm really excited to dive in and learn more about you. But just kind of give us an overview, what you've been doing over the last couple of decades, really, in the industry, and where you think America is right now with the state of our housing.
That's a good set of information to go over. So in my career, I somehow decided I went to graduate school to get my MBA. And I decided when I was in graduate school that I really wanted to go into commercial real estate. And I had some family background for that, which was that my family has been in construction since before the Depression. And they were a major subcontractor on a lot of properties all over the U.S., hotels, office buildings, whatever. So I grew up kind of hearing about the business. So I had it in my head that I wanted to go into construction lending when I got out of graduate school, and I did. And so that set me up. I went to a major money center bank here in Chicago, which is where I'm from. That bank was Continental Bank, which was later acquired by Bank of America. And my timing was a little bit off, I guess, if I would say that. You know, in retrospect, it seemed like it at the time, because when I started at Continental Bank, I had to go through a training program that lasted about 6 months. And just as I was coming out of the training program, Continental Bank failed and was shut down by the FDIC and then reopened as a new bank that was basically a split bank. There was the FDIC owned portion of the bank and then the regular rest of the bank, which really contained more of the healthier loans. But even though the bank was split into two, those of us that were in the commercial real estate department, whether we had experience or not, honestly, all of a sudden had to start working on distressed loans because everything got distressed or was distressed. And so we didn't have a choice. So it wound up being fantastic experience for me. And the takeaway I think about my early career was that move to Continental Bank set me up for my entire career, because a lot of the people that I worked with in that department went on to be major leaders in the apartment industry or in the financing side of commercial real estate. So my connections from the get-go were just like, I realized it was such a stroke of luck that even though I was doing something that seemed like it was going to taint my career because all I was doing was handling bad loans, it really set me up because of the relationships I built. So fast forward, I've been on the debt side of commercial real estate through banking. I decided I wanted to be on the equity side, meaning doing the acquisitions of properties to invest that, companies would invest in. And I did that with Prudential's pension fund investing group for a while. And as each cycle sort of evolved, because as you know, whether you're in for sale housing or on the commercial side, there's always cycles to our business. And so as the cycles evolved, as I kind of moved forward in my career, I specialized in two areas. One was the apartment industry, and the other was distressed debt. And the distressed debt side of my career really allowed me to have a job when there were virtually no jobs to be had in many places in the country, especially during the GFC. So I've specialized in the apartment side of the business because honestly, doing distressed debt can be it can be a very conflict-oriented endeavor for a while. And it really depends on who you're dealing with on the other side, who the borrower is, because they can approach things rationally and try to work with you so that both sides get a better resolution, or they can fight with the lender. And then that usually gets pretty ugly. There's a lot of the banks, especially the bigger banks, will decide to spend money over a period of time to fight you if you're a borrower and you're not going to cooperate. So long story short is I learned a lot of things about the business. I made a lot of really great contacts. And I decided after I'd gotten into the apartment business, I really wanted to focus on that as long as I was able to, meaning as long as the economy was behind me. And so I went to work for a major apartment REIT here in Chicago that was started by Sam Zell, and that company was Equity Residential. And so I worked for them for about 5 years. I was fortunate enough to be there when the company had, right after it had just gone public and owned about 20,000 units. And I was a VP of acquisitions for about half of my 5 years. And then I was a VP of asset management for the last half of my 5 years. So when I left the company in 1998, we had been 20,000 units when I started, and we had grown it to maybe about 190,000 units in 5 years, which was just like a phenomenal feat. I still don't even know how we did it. But it was a great, just intense exercise in understanding the apartment business. So I've continued to stay in that side of the business as I've been able, but I've always understood sort of what makes the market difficult and what makes it be in a situation like it is now, where there is more and more distress as time's going by because of the higher interest rates. So that's kind of the short version of my career. And I would say what I'm seeing now, I mean, Todd, just jump in if you have any particular questions, but what I'm seeing now is there's been this sort of continuation of conditions getting worse in commercial real estate as far as the lenders are concerned, especially the big banks, because they're not lending anymore. They've really cut that spigot off unless you have a really conservatively structured loan that can work at these higher interest rates. So they've definitely pulled back on their lending, and they are grappling with increasing loans going into distress. And I think that's happening. Probably you're seeing some of this as well, Todd, is that as a distress happens, because people can't refinance their loans at the rates that they originally did them with, those rates have gone up. So they're now finding that their properties are worth less. So therefore they can't borrow as much. And as that happens, that creates distress. And it's happening on the for sale housing side, on my side of the business, wherever there's an asset that's secured by real estate and its debt is coming due last year, this year, and probably into next year, there's going to be distress because they can't borrow at the same amount that they had before. And most people don't have a big chunk of cash just waiting to pay down their loan so that they can refinance it at this point. So it's, I guess I would compare it to the GFC, where during the global financial crisis, it was just everything was going bad. This has been a little bit of a slower, unwind, if you will. And so not everything has gone bad. Certainly office buildings have gone bad because so many people are not working in their offices anymore. And I think that the economy is sort of in this unusual space where there are jobs being created, but income isn't going up. And the jobs being created is certainly very helpful, but there's so many signs of like a looming recession, with the inverted yield curve, with people having so much more debt than they used to and not being able to probably service it. I know because of my conversations, there are a lot of consumer loans that are now going into distress, and certainly credit cards are going into distress. And so if there's one thing that I could impart to your audience is be proactive about any situations where you have payments that you can't make. Talk to whoever that is. That is like my biggest piece of advice for people is don't just let it fester. Just be proactive. If you're proactive, you at least have some possible options to consider as opposed to winding up in a completely terrible situation. But that's what people are facing right now. So it's kind of a really bifurcated economy, I think. I don't, you can tell me what you're seeing, Todd, but I think it's an unusual time in terms of whether there's really a recession looming or if we're going to find our way out of this kind of no growth mode that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think an overview of what you just said is that we're in bad shape. I mean,
yeah.
we can cut this.
We can
down.
sugarcoat it. Yeah,
yeah, we can cut this down and say that we're in bad shape. And I want to talk about this wave. And though a lot of our audience is more on the residential side, and I want people to understand that we're talking about housing inflation. What you have been working in most of your career with the acquisition of multifamily, housing, it's commercial real estate. Right. A lot of people they don't realize that apartment buildings are considered commercial. Right. Anytime you're dealing with more than 4 units in a structure, that is a commercial, typically a commercial transaction, commercial loan. But I want to go over a couple of things, Leslie, because I've been in commercial real estate for quite some time.
Yeah.
Not to your level. I don't even want to pretend to be playing in your same playground because you dwarf me substantially with the knowledge of commercial multifamily housing from both sides, from the lending side. Well, I'd say from all 3 sides, analyzing the deal, funding the deal or seeing that it gets funded on whether you were working for the bank or the buyer, the purchaser, the operator will say. And then the profitability side of things where, there has to be profit. And when I got into the commercial real estate, there was such thing as called a cap rate. And I don't even
there
think
still is.
Yeah, well, but not really, right? Because and what they were looking for, of course, the big you're buying future income. So when you're buying a multifamily or any kind of income producing asset, you're buying future income. That's what you're paying. You're paying today's price in hopes for more return as time goes on. And we do that in many different ways. It's done by, number one, buying it right, or, certainly being able to enhance the property and make it more valuable to where you can get more money for it in rents. And then really financing has everything to do with it, operations and financing, because you have to keep those costs low in order to be profitable. And as well as I do, being in this business, cap rates kind of went by the wayside. We had these operators over the last 4 or 5 years, especially, that have been saying, I can get you double-digit returns. Come on, we're going to buy these apartment assets, and they were raising this money, and investors are now on capital calls, and they're trying to, save these assets they're quite frankly, they're going to get lost for pennies on the dollar. I want to ask your opinion because, going through the great financial crisis is a global financial crisis, but most people say great financial crisis, but was a big real estate crash.
Yes.
Amongst other things, it was an asset crash. It was a real estate crash. To get this out of the way, because you worked basically for Wall Street. I mean, let's just face it. I mean, when you look at your resume, you work for Wall Street.
Yes. Do you just in a different vehicle? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it was a good or a bad thing for the Obama administration to package up single family homes and sell them to Wall Street investors?
Well, that had really actually started happening much earlier before that, which is what led to the GFC, because the sentiment behind the for sale housing market in the U.S. had always been that the U.S. homeowner is not going to default on their own home loan. And so the country kind of got swayed into that whole myth that it could never fail, which obviously is, totally faulty. Because what happened was all those loans. So, as far as I'm concerned, if I can get into all the minutia of how and why that happened, but when Wall Street was rating the loan packages that Fannie and Freddie were selling, and they were selling them all over the world, like there were sovereign funds of certain countries that went so long in U.S. debt from Fannie and Freddie on homes in the United States that they believed that these people would never default. So, what had happened, the lead up to that 08 period, the 05, 06, 07 period in my business, you could see it coming because I was selling a lot of properties in the era before the GFC. And these were apartment properties that some of them were pristine and absolutely beautiful, and anyone would want to own them. And, they're $100 million. I sold a property in Gaithersburg, Maryland, as a matter of fact, near you, Todd, where it was an institutional developer, meaning a Wall Street developer, if you will, an apartment REIT, 600-unit property, sold it for $100 million to a pension fund advisor out of Boston. And that Boston pension fund got that deal because the first buyer flaked, and the first buyer was a partnership of a local condo converter along with Starwood Capital, because they were his money partner. And when they saw that the condo market had slowed down at the end of 05, meaning people just weren't waiting in line to buy speculative condo properties from a converted apartment property into condos, there was no line of people around the street waiting to get those anymore. They realized that their plan for that $100 million, 600-unit asset in Gaithersburg was just not going to work because no one was going to buy those condos. So they were paying a price that they really couldn't justify. So that was happening all over the country, whether it was on apartment deals or whether it was on single-family home bundles.
I still consider condominiums more of a, even though that's kind of a different animal than a single-family home.
It is. It definitely is.
That's a multifamily environment.
But the logic, that's what was so crazy, is the logic for all these package loans still applied when they were bundling up whatever kind of debt, as long as someone owned it and was obligated to make a payment on it because they had, a loan against the property. There was still this mentality is that the American consumer will not default on their single family.
But more specifically, bundling up those loans and selling them for pennies on a dollar to Wall Street and putting them in the single family rental industry. Do you think that had anything to do with the fact of lack of affordability now?
Oh yeah. There's no doubt in my mind. You don't even have to, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but you don't have to finish that question. So what I was going to say about what happened in 08 is that because lending criteria had just gone out the window because there was so much demand for this paper. Investors wanted to own paper that was basically backed by U.S. mortgages of whatever kind, but let's say specifically for sale housing. And so when that happened, that crisis, you wound up with a lot of people who had to default on their loans because they had no business buying a home in the first place. So that definitely happened before Obama. That really happened more in the Clinton period because there were policies that were put into place so that it made it easier.
But Wall Street was never buying them.
No, they weren't. But they were making the money off of it though because they were getting fees.
But that's different. But now they're double ending it. Now they're double ending it.
Yeah.
Because they're turning it into rental properties.
Right.
And they're making the money on, the debt side of things, which is, because they're building equity. They have instant equity. You buy something for 30 cents on the dollar because somebody lost it. And now you feed it to, this machine that gets their fangs into the single family residential market at thousands of scale,
right?
Hundreds of thousands at scale. And now all of a sudden we're on that same inflation path because they own the real estate. Of course, rents are going to go up, right? I mean, this is Wall Street money buying this property. They are milking it. You get a residential landlord, and I've been one for the better part of 25 years. What happens is you get a good tenant in there, and as long as they're paying your mortgage payment and you have a decent rate and you can make money and you have a good tenant, your turnover costs are way too high to risk raising that rent 3 or 4% every single year. After they've been in there for 3 years, the rent is now out of market for the most part, and they're looking to save money, and you're going to turn it over just by pushing the rent envelope. So a lot of times these mom and pop landlords have never raised rent. They've had people in there for 4 or 5 years. Affordability's good. They're happy. They're making some money. They have somebody in the house that loves it, treats it like their own, or they'd be out by now. But now you have a Wall Street company that owns a single family house, and they're raising that rent without fail every single year, pushing that affordability down and the inflation on shelter inflation higher.
It is an unfortunate fact of, so when Wall Street gets involved in the ownership of anything that's residential, let's just put it that way, they are yield driven. So they're paid. The people are paid based on how good of returns that they get. So they're paid on how well they buy the property, how well it performs while they own it, and how well it performs if they choose to sell it. So it almost doesn't matter what the type of real estate that it is. When that is the type of owner behind it, they're definitely yield driven because they have to do, it's like having.
But it does matter.
It does
matter what kind of real estate, because a retail buyer, someone that wants to raise a family in that home, is not getting the home because of the competition from the Wall Street buyers. When you look at a third of the houses in America, especially since the pandemic or during the pandemic era, a third of those houses were institutional buyers or investors competing against the homeowners, raising that home price up, making the lack of affordability in America part of what it is today.
Yeah, I'm not in disagreement with you at all. And so that's all I'm trying to say, is that when Wall Street is into the home ownership business, this is exactly what you're going to experience. Right. And the only thing that is curtailing that now is that there's a bit of a wait and see on Wall Street's part, because there's definitely a lot of cash on the sidelines. They would be investing more, but the sellers aren't, at least on the commercial real estate side, sellers aren't sellers at this point because they've got to take too big of a hit.
And it's not their money.
Exactly. Unless there's some kind of gun to their head, like there are certain commercial owners who may be a closed-end fund for a pension fund or whatever, and so they have to sell out everything in that fund within a certain time frame. So that's a seller who has a gun to his head. Or if there's a loan coming due and they know they can't replace it, that's a seller who has a gun to his head. So you can have anybody be in that position. It doesn't matter. It wouldn't have to be a Wall Street group, but that hasn't really happened yet. And that's the big mystery in our business, as to why it's mostly been office buildings that have gone bad. And we're seeing more consumer debt go bad. We're not probably going to see that much in single family home residential debt go bad unless it's maturing now in this period.
Unless the federal government stops stimulating or doing loan modifications or jamming loan modifications down the lenders' throats.
Yes. Well, that may happen. I never experienced that, honestly. I think what happens instead is that the regulators work with banks to make sure when the periods of distress get really acute, the regulators are sitting on the bank's back basically to recognize in a timely fashion what's really going on. So and now we're talking about the big banks, because I don't work at a small bank. I've never worked at, so I can't really speak to that. Although I'm even seeing that with some of the smaller banks. They're starting to see more distress in other than office product. And it's definitely with the debt coming due now. If it comes, it may be that it's having a performance issue because they're not cash flowing enough, because it's lost tenants or whatever, because the rents went too high. But the distress has been mainly with properties that are now having debt maturities. And so where this goes from here is anybody's guess, because it's truly one of the most unusual recessions I've ever seen occur. Because if you personally, I don't know that I believe all the numbers coming out of the current administration. They wind up correcting the job growth numbers on a regular basis. They issue them Wall Street rallies, and then they come back a couple months later and say, "Oh, we got that wrong. It's really been less." And so I don't know what to believe.
No implications.
No implications. Just that's been a pattern. I mean, that's all I'm stating.
With every administration, honestly, I feel,
well, that's the game. They all want to look good. I mean, it's just
right.
PR as far as I'm concerned. But
right.
I think that
not on their watch. They don't want it to fall apart on their watch because
exactly.
They want that legacy. Let's talk about. I want to dive into because I know in reading some of the bullet points ahead of time to discuss. I want to ask first of all. Are you familiar with Ivy Zellman? I
am, and I think she's a very compelling person. She has always been someone that I've listened to, and her predictions in housing I think are spot on a lot of the time.
So let me ask you a question, because you're in the multifamily sector, and I know a lot of operators.
Yeah.
Certainly not to the scale that you do, but I do know a lot of operators, some that own 30, 40,000 doors. Big operators.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. And when you mention 600 units or whatever in Maryland, when I have anybody that reaches out across wherever they are and they call up and they're like, "Oh yeah, I want to buy 120 or 100 plus unit apartment complex," we don't have them in Maryland. So they're rare. They never come up for sale. I mean, it's kind of, and if they do, maybe it's an off market deal. We have a couple operators here that do own those assets, but we're not flush with them like a lot of states are. Most of our, communities are older. We are seeing some newer multifamily development, but we don't have a lot of development going on in Maryland at all. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is design, right? I want to talk about the potential for a glut. And there's a couple things, several years ago, and again, I live in this space, have friends all over the country. But every crane has been occupied. If you wanted to buy, if you wanted a crane to build a multifamily building, you were waiting years in order to get that. You had to put those orders in. I mean, the cranes are occupied all over the country in these major cities. Nashville. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. Cranes in the horizon. As well as I know, I've been a developer. It takes years to stick a shovel in the ground. When you're doing a community, you have to go through community impact hearings. You have all kinds of departments that you're traveling through, regulation after regulation, millions and millions of dollars of soft costs before you even stick that shovel in the ground. You could even be a decade before working on developing a property before you can build it. So we know a lot of this speculation that goes into the marketplace is done way before and committed before a recession is apparent. You go back 10 years. I mean, you didn't know what was happening 10 years ago, other than you hope that you plan for a recession, because every 10 or 15 years or so nowadays, we get them.
Right.
But people want to say that we are and I know you said we're in an inventory shortage, and I want to clarify it because you were more specific, an affordable housing shortage.
Right.
But Ivy Zellman thinks that we're in a shortage. I disagree with that. In my opinion, we are going to see the biggest glut in multifamily housing than we've ever seen. And we are going to continue to build them. The whitehouse.gov on October of last year, October 23, they put a fact sheet out that spoke about how they want to take all these office buildings that are in default or that won't be sold as office buildings and convert them into multifamily housing along mass transportation lines, right? There's the fact sheet, mass transportation lines. We're already in a glut. We've got over 1 million units coming on this year alone, and that are going to be finishing out. And in fact, when that slows down, we're going to have a massive construction recession because a lot of these workers won't have jobs. But do you, and kind of teeing that up and setting that up, I mean, obviously, way more experience in this multifamily housing than I do. What do you believe? Do you think we're looking at a glut in apartments, or do you think we're looking at a shortage?
I think, in apartments, I guess I would say the shortage is really when you factor in the whole country. So the shortage is that if you look at the population, that's where the figures that I was stating, it's looking at the whole population across the country, no matter where it is, that there's not enough housing units for that population. Specifically for multifamily, there is a glut at the high end because even when rents were really, when rates were really low, the low rates were like the developer's boon because it made it a lot easier for them to finance a property and have it make money. Because what happens is when you're developing a large apartment property, let's say something 100 units or more, when you're developing something like that, you need you need people to rent that up as it becomes available and continue occupying it and paying rent increases probably to justify the financing in order to do it. So generally, in a lot of locations, most of what has gotten developed in the last, let's call it 20 years even, certainly in the last 10, has been at the high end of the market with expensive rents in urban areas. Very difficult to make those numbers work on that kind of a property the further out you get from the CBD. It happens in certain pockets of suburbs, which I'm sure you're aware of, Todd. But what's been the most difficult thing to develop is the affordable housing, because the costs are the same, but the rent structure is lower. So the returns that are available to the ownership that develop those affordable apartments are much lower. So you're looking for people to be satisfied with a lower return overall, and that obviously isn't the American way. So that's why there's a shortage of that. And I think that it's very specific. It's not just a shortage or an oversupply across the board. The shortage may be that there just isn't enough housing for the population overall, but I don't think anybody can dispute the fact that there's just not enough affordable housing. As you look at any major city, and that's the case. But let's turn to what you were talking about with what's happening in the Biden administration. The gist of what they're trying to do is even one step further, because they ultimately would like to stop seeing single family zoning in certainly in major urban markets, but even in many suburban markets as well. They do not want people to be able to build single family homes. I think that ultimately is a problem for a lot of Americans because it's still the American dream. And so I think that this crazy ride we've been on has been happening for probably the better part of 30 years, because as soon as the administration gets into the mix of trying to promote housing or not promoting housing or whatever, I think personally, because I believe in the free market economy, they're mucking with the free market, and somehow, some way, it's going to wind up blowing up. And so that's what we've seen. And then maybe if you marry that up with what's been happening with our increasing national debt, then it's no wonder that we've got this kind of like mixed bag of what are we really in terms of our economy. So I fail to totally have my arms around it, because I think it's a very confusing situation, because there are things bigger than us with our national debt that could affect us if we're not like cognizant of what is happening there and start to deal with it, because I think it's kind of scary.
So to go along to your point, and I agree, we're in a glut, and to go along with your point about affordable housing, and there's a famous narrative where it says we want affordable housing, but not here. And what we hear is the pushback is when they start, and we have Fort Hood here in Maryland. It's an old base.
Yes.
It's been closed forever. Just this year, we had the quadennium zoning hearing in Baltimore County, which is one of our major markets here that we serve. And I want to tell you, there was a high school, Dundalk High School. Anybody can search this. And I was there specifically for a property that I have that I'm trying to get automotive service added to a business local zoning. So I was there for my own edification for a piece of commercial property that I have. This school was packed. The project is a affordable housing project that a developer wants to put 500 houses in Fort Hood. You believe this high school had lines of police officers standing up and in the aisles, and it was a hostile crowd, and everybody was screaming, you can't put affordable housing. They weren't saying that they don't want affordable housing type of buyer or tenant what they were saying, because they couldn't come out and say, we don't want people that can't afford to be in this neighborhood. We don't want them here. They couldn't say that. So they said stuff like, oh, well, you've got Fox that won't have a place to live. They've been occupying. We want a park. We want this. We want that. So people will fight affordable housing tooth and nail.
Yes.
And who is the reason why housing costs so much today? What's the number one driving force of housing costs where they are today?
Well, land, because there's less of it in my major cities, but also just construction costs, and then rents. People want a return.
Regulation.
So when you add all that up, exactly. Yes.
Regulation. The government could cut red tape anytime they want. I was at an event with the Secretary of HUD at the time and Dr. Ben Carson. I had a great conversation with him, and he was asking me my opinion about, the housing industry and costs and things like this. This was years ago. And he was still in the administration. And, he said the red tape has to get cut. We have to cut the red tape. If you're a developer and it's going to take you 10 years and millions, tens of millions of dollars to stick a shovel in the ground on a property, and you go through all the regulations, all the infrastructure, everything that you have to do to make that community, are you going to want to build a smaller place and make less per square foot? Because you're building no, you're going to build as big of a box as you can. You're going to put as many units as you possibly can, and you're going to make it as luxurious as you possibly can, because that is what brings you your money back. So it's backwards. It's upside down. Throwing, a more regulation and saying that we're going to take these office buildings and convert them. The government's going to get involved in this. And in no time in history that I've seen where we have any type of intervention like this to a problem, does it make it any better?
I can't disagree with you at all. As a matter of fact, I agree with you totally. And what I was further going to say is this whole office building conversion idea. I don't know who came up with that, but I will be happy to see that actually work. But there are just so limited examples that I have seen where it's been done and done effectively. And the reason is you're generally having to jackhammer through concrete floors to put in plumbing risers. Now, that costs a lot of money, and it's not for the faint of heart, because whenever you start to renovate an existing building for even just a light duty change of use, meaning it's not really fundamentally changing, you run a lot of risks because you don't know what's behind the walls. I mean, that was one of the things that I learned early on when I worked for my dad coming out of college. My dad had a bunch of older, I would call them mid-rise now, because they weren't truly high-rise buildings in the South Loop of Chicago, in an area called Printers Road. They were getting converted from old printers buildings where they did printing to condominiums or apartments. And you didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that you had to be really careful about taking on those kinds of construction assignments as a contractor like my dad, because if you got behind the walls and what you bid wasn't what it was really going to cost you, guess who pays that bill? It's the subcontractor. So, I just don't personally agree with that formula. I'm not sure who came up with it or why the administration thinks that that's a good idea. It seems to make some sense because at least they know could be a source of housing, but I'm going to guarantee you that it's going to be expensive. The rents on those kinds of properties are not going to be affordable.
No, you're right. But let me tell you why. And I know some operators that are doing it, and I'll tell you why they're doing it. Office space, you need about 3.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of office building. Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at from a density standpoint, right, it's a reduction of density to put housing in there. You need, for a 2-bedroom, you need 1.5 spaces per 2-bedroom apartment, at least here in most of Maryland, the regulations. So what they're enabled to do at this point is they can take that building and they can buy it for pennies on the dollar because it's in default in a lot of cases. I know one that's specifically right now 46,000 square feet in receivership with Wells Fargo. And you can buy it at about half the tax assessed value, which is really probably more like 30 cents or 35 cents on what that loan or that value was originally, stated at the time of loan origination, which was only about 4 or 5 years ago during the pandemic. But anyway, you can reduce the density of that. And then what a lot of these operators will do, and they're very expensive. You're right. The rents are not cheap. This is not affordable housing. What they do is they can sell off or maybe build a couple of pad sites because the parking lots are big enough that they can squeeze in those parking requirements. And it's almost like a walkthrough permit process, because it's a reduction of density and a lighter use. So it's usually favored, at least here, I know, in Maryland. And then they can get those pad sites where they can put the Starbucks or the Dunkin' or something like that, and they can make additional money with that. But yeah, it's almost like a day late, dollar short as far as the government getting involved, because we've got a glut of housing.
Right.
And this affordable housing, we're getting people away from the American dream by doing this, which I think is part of the overall plan. I
agree with you on that. If you can say to people that you'll own nothing and like it, that is just so the antithesis of the American dream. I just don't know why people would somehow want to change their psyche that much that would be.
Can you imagine how disruptive? How disruptive it would be to know that somebody can force you out at any given moment. They can just tell you that they're not renewing your lease, and you have kids in a school system that they have friends in, and this and that, and just that in the back of their mind of never really owning the property. And look, I believe it has to be a right time to own, but to tell somebody that should not be a part of the American dream, Leslie, and I love talking to you, by the way. I mean,
thank you.
We're going to have, I'm hoping that we have a lot more conversations than just this podcast.
Thanks, me too.
But here's what I want to say. Home ownership. There are people that buying a home was the only investment they ever made in their entire life.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you think about that, but that to them was the achievement of the American dream. And God bless them, because they worked hard to be able to do that. And somehow we've gotten away from that. And it's not to say, because here I've made my career a lot built on the apartment industry. So it's not that I want apartments to succeed over, home ownership. It's not that at all. Or even maybe vice versa to some extent, because there's a need for rental apartments in places where there's a changing population, changing demographic, or, whatever. There's just need for some flexibility. Right. But generally, the thing that has been so grounded with the American population is that they grow up at some point, get married, have families, and want to have a place of their own. And I think that is still the American dream, even though it's gotten further out of reach at this point, especially because of the price of housing has, especially in Chicago here, the increasing home values here is just almost like, it's just mind-boggling. The fact that we've seen values increase in the suburbs as much as we have. I just don't remember. I remember periods of time where value decreases were similar to this, meaning of the same magnitude, but I don't remember this kind of a steep increase in.
Never.
Yeah. It's shocking. It's shocking. Yeah. And then at the same time, you've got a lot of people like me and my husband and my family that we refinanced when rates were low in the threes. And so what's my incentive to go somewhere? I've got a big enough house.
For less.
Yeah. Well, that's my husband going, well, we could go buy a smaller house somewhere, but guess what? Our mortgage payment's going to be about the same. And I'm like, well, that's not my idea of what I'd like to achieve later on, but at the same time, it still gets down to the fact that we don't intend not to be owners of where we live. It does provide stability, and it provides, I think, the country with a sense of we belong. And I think there's something really fundamental to that when we get away from that, there's something wrong. I think that if that's not what we are anymore, then someone better define to me what we have changed to, because I don't know that I understand that.
Do you think, and look, and I'm certainly not criticizing you serving the apartment industry. I think that that's where Wall Street belonged in the first place. I never thought that they should belong in single family housing or competing against their homeowners. I think that they should be using this syndication or these operators buying, even if they can buy them on their own and then refinance them, for a purpose of having an alternative for those change in life, for those people just starting out, for the more transient people that are coming to areas where there may only be for 1 or 2 or 3 years. I think there's a great space for that. I don't have a problem with real estate investors. And, when I listen to Powell talk, and it's been frequently, probably more than I ever listened to any other chairman of the Federal Reserve, obviously because this is the worst real estate bubble we've ever had. Everything bubble, but housing market, this dwarfs the GFC, leading up to the GFC. This dwarfs that 2006 peak by a magnitude that if this does blow, we're really going to see some ugliness happen, way worse than what we saw in the GFC. But let's talk about rents, because interestingly enough, rents in America, I don't think have ever come down. I mean, I don't think ever have we had a reset of rents.
I'm not going to completely agree with you on that.
Okay. Tell me.
Because I know during the GFC, because I've worked for people or I still have good contacts. We talk frequently with people in my industry, especially here in the Chicago area. Their real rents went down the equivalent of a 3-month concession.
In apartments
here in the Chicago. Yeah, I mean, especially like in the neighborhood.
So you just said something.
Yeah,
you just said something, and I'm glad you did. What did you say? 3-month concession.
Right.
So given a 15-month lease for a 12-month pay.
Right.
That's bingo. So my point, and I'm glad you said that.
Yeah.
Because apartment owners don't drop rents. The realized rents
they try not to.
They try not to, and I want you to explain that.
Okay, so I will make a distinction here. The Wall Street owners will decrease rents because they stop. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them stop playing that game where they would offer a concession, because truly all it is it's a math equation. And so when you're offering a special, that's what we call them, as a special, it's a concession. It's an inducement to the renter to rent at a particular property. And so you sign a lease, and if it has a special, it'll have some period of time where you don't pay the rent. It could be a week, it could be 2, it could be a month, it could be 3. But when we went into the GFC, there were especially new properties here in Chicago. Instead of only offering maybe a 1-month concession to lease up the property initially, they were offering 3 months. And that meant that they weren't permanently lowering their rents, because it's the game that most owners, whether they're Wall Street owners or not, they all play the game of they want to keep their market rate rents at a same or higher level. And because they don't want to decrease that number, because they view that it impacts the value of the property negatively. Well, honestly, when you're smart enough to understand how apartments operate, it's going to affect the value of the property if you're giving a larger concession, because you're really looking at what your economic rents are. What do you really collect? So if you really understand that difference, that is how more sophisticated owners understand rents and what they like to do with them, because they don't want to permanently drop rents. That's like the big bugaboo. And frankly, the single family rental housing that Wall Street owns, they do the same thing. I mean, it's no different. It's just a function of math.
And I'm so glad, ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Leslie. This is the proof that she knows what she's talking about, because she walked right in the door with that. But I want to ask the question now, do you think that rents will drop probably for the first time ever, not concessions, but actual real rents? Do you think we will see a decline anytime in the near future?
Well, if we really are in for the kind of recession that you think we're in for, and P.S., I think we're in for, I'm afraid that this is going to be one of the worst cycles, even worse than the Great Depression. I don't know. But I mean, when you're combining all the different factors that are happening here globally and with what's happening in the U.S., my husband and I, it's like we don't sleep at night some nights. And maybe we're old enough that we realize what all this stuff means now that we didn't care about when we were younger. But if that is really what happens to this country and probably the world, then yes, we will have decreases in rents because there just won't be the ability to charge more because people won't have money. And you're already seeing signs of that. There's a big increase in defaults on auto loans. Some of the smaller banks that I know here in Chicago, because I'm talking to them, I am in the midst of a new position search because the apartment business is virtually dead right now unless you had money going into this whole era. So I've been talking to the banks about doing distressed debt again, and they're seeing more consumer loans going bad. They're starting to have more home defaults. And so I think people have been kind of hanging on lately because if they have jobs, they can at least get by. But the real beginning of the pain was when inflation hit, and it hit in this administration, despite what they want to tell you, by what they did that I think was particularly going to set us up for these high inflation periods that we have right now, is that when they came in and decided they didn't want to do any more drilling within the United States and they shut down the Keystone Pipeline, what that did is it signaled to Wall Street, especially private equity, to exit oil and gas investments. And when they did that, that meant this country is not going to be behind producing oil and gas. So that automatically meant all of our costs were going to increase. And that's exactly what's happened. And when that happened, the consumer wasn't making more money, but everything they were buying was costing more, even, especially food. I mean, you have to have food to live. There's only a few things you have to spend money on just to live, and that's one of them. And when you have to go to the grocery store every week and see how much more it's costing you and you don't have the extra money, well, that's what happens. You get distressed because people have to use credit cards. They have to cut their lifestyles. All these negative things start to fall out of that. And we're at the beginning of that, meaning that it's been happening out for a while, but it hasn't really kind of whipsawed into this, disastrous frenzy, which I think it has the potential to do, and soon.
As far as, let's kind of wind down.
Yeah.
Let's talk about banking because you have a lot of experience with this. I believe that we will see rent declines, not rent increases. I think that the government is going to see to it. When you hear people like Jay Powell saying that housing, inflation, shelter inflation, more specifically, is what it's called, the rents need to come down. When you have the Federal Reserve saying rents need to come down, that's a lot of downward pressure, right? So whether you're talking about, how they get there or not, when you have increased rent controls and you're capping what operators can increase, and I get that, why that is too, but they weren't planning on that when they bought those assets, especially if they bought them in the last 5 years, with refinance being a problem because now they need cash, which they don't have, because they're not going to refinance for the same loan amount that they gave them, probably because the numbers don't work based on the interest rates being double what they were when they bought the asset. Taking all those things into consideration, with banks, about 70% of banks' balance sheets are commercial real estate. We just saw Republic First go bust. Fulton Bank just took them over. I think a lot of that had to do with multifamily. You would know better than me. When you take all of this into consideration, the operators are in trouble. What will this look like for banks as they turn the keys back to these non-recourse multifamily loans?
Well, generally what happens is, the banks don't like to have to take back properties, but there's only a limited number of alternatives they have at their disposal to deal with a problem loan. So what happens when that happens is if they are set up to handle that, meaning if they're a larger bank, they'll have their own REO group, and that means real estate owned. And by charter, banks cannot own real estate that's not for their own business use for more than 5 years. So if they have to foreclose and take those assets back, they go on their REO books and they have to be sold. And so they'll pretty much immediately get listed, and they'll get listed at the lowest possible price to clear the debt, which means very much reduced from where it had been in terms of value. And then that will depress all the values in the neighborhood because you'll start seeing more of that activity. And so it's a downward spiral. It's like this snowball effect. So it is not pleasant, and it is a lot of distress for people because it is their home a lot of times that we're talking about, whether it's an apartment or a single family home. But the cash that's sitting on the sidelines, and there is plenty of it, they will be in a buying frenzy. And there already is. There's a lot of sidelined dry powder. I mean, there's a lot of money that's just waiting to see more distress, but it hasn't yet occurred in the numbers that they'd like to see it. But if you're talking about a smaller bank that experiences more distressed debt, what happens with those is that they generally don't have enough capital to sustain the losses that they need to in order to take those properties back and then put them back on the for sale market. And so that's when you see these bank failures, because they've depleted their ability to take the hits on their capital based on the losses that those loans are producing. So that is usually when you see they get shut down by the FDIC. The depositors who have, up to or under the limit of the FDIC insurance amount of, I think it's $250,000 in any one account, those depositors will get made whole because the FDIC is basically a big insurance policy. So they basically bail out the depositors, but the bank itself is non-functional at that point because it usually gets bought by another bank, and that another bank is assisted by the FDIC to buy the failed bank. And then that new bank, if you will, works out all that distressed debt because they will have the capital to hopefully deal with those issues, or somehow they work out an agreement with the FDIC. And what most people don't know is that when a bank shuts down, like when FDIC shut down IndyMac Bank, IndyMac was a fairly large bank and it got shut down by the FDIC and the GFC. When that happened, the FDIC comes in and they have a very specific formula of what the new buyer of that bank will get as a result of resolving loans. And it's a 5-year formula. And if the new bank waits as long as possible, because remember, that's a 5-year period that they can own real estate that's not for their own business use. So if they wait the longest period to resolve those loans or to sell the properties, they get the highest return. So their incentive is to do nothing for a while, which in some ways maybe is good, I guess, because it doesn't like pile on all this more stress into the system, because you've got more assets clearing in a shorter period of time. If you didn't do it that way, I don't know. I mean, I can argue that both sides, because I think
they're hoping the values go up.
Well, they're hoping the values go up, but frankly, a lot of times it just drags out longer. Because I will tell you, I don't think the GFC was really over here in Chicago until 2015, maybe even at the earliest. Florida was already gangbusters by then, and so was Texas. But Chicago is not really recovered. I mean, we still have a net outflow of population. And you've seen the major corporations that are leaving here, and it's all because of the tax structure. So, and also the fact that crime has just gone crazy in downtown Chicago, worse than I've ever seen it. I mean, just dreadful. But anyway, that's what happens. And so when all those pressures come together, what you see is declining prices and decreasing rents. And that there's no other way to put it. That's what happens.
Yeah. Well, Leslie, it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on our show.
Same here.
I certainly, here, ladies and gentlemen, here you have one of our viewers so passionate about getting her knowledge out so that people are aware of what's really happening. We need more of this, and we thank you so much. I look forward to doing it again real soon.
Thanks, me too. Appreciate it.
Talk soon.
Thanks. Take care, Todd.
Did you love Leslie as much as I did? I mean, come on, what an amazing interview, and she is so experienced. I hope that we get to have her back on the show more. If you'd like to see Leslie back, drop your comments below. And if you like the video, you can let Leslie and I both know that you did by hitting that thumbs up button. And guys, if you haven't already subscribed to Sachs Realty, please consider doing so now. And the biggest compliment that you could ever do for me as the host of your show at Sachs Realty is to share this channel or this video with your family and friends. Let's make this community one of the biggest out there and the largest voice in serving this industry on YouTube. See you next time. Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.